my goal in part 3 is really to get us to see what we've inherited, to see what it is that sort of may not be immediately apparent to us, right? There's that a statement that some people make that seeing is believing, which is one of the most woefully naive epistemological positions. We have experienced and we know a lot of things apart from our 5 senses. To say it a little bit differently, there are things that we cannot experience, but that they make experience possible. If you don't mind me getting a little bit philosophical here, talking a little bit about epistemology. We don't necessarily see time and space, for instance, but these two are the conditions that make our experience possible. We can't see the mechanism, that part of our brain that allows us to see. Nonetheless, we assume that it's there. It's almost like we have a faith that it's there. For those of us who are Christians, we face the criticism that we can't see, we can't experience God with our 5 senses, so God must be nonsense, right? That's a very, like I said, it's a very immature or philosophically naive position to suggest that all that we can know, we must experience it immediately. So as I mentioned last time, there are things that we absorb into our subconscious, that is, that we're not conscious of, but then they come out into consciousness when the conditions are about right. It's not that we can never see these things. I would suggest that it really takes time for us to meditate. It takes time for us to see these things. Now, portion B of part 3, I want to deal with the portion of inherited racism that we often refer to as systemic racism. I don't want to confuse the two. I still want to emphasize the aspect of inherited racism. I'm a little bit wary of the term. I understand what the phrase systemic racism refers to, and I certainly can appreciate it, and I use it in parts, but I would suggest that we have to be careful that systems often suggest a coherence. But we're dealing with culture, and certainly culture is connected to socioeconomic or material conditions. But I think there are, in this system, systemic racism, there are joints that is sort of weak joints in the system that if we were able to identify, we'd be able to kind of like force them apart a bit in order to change the context, to then change our awareness of racism. So the system in the minds of many people is very tight. And in some cases, I think they are. And the examples that I will give today, I will focus on the tight connections to systemic racism. But perhaps there's areas that we can explore where the joints in the system or the blocks in the system are a bit wobbly. And again, I want to look at this. I want to attack this from a slightly different angle. You all can look online, and more people are doing this nowadays. People are buying books. They are downloading videos on YouTube about systemic racism. So you can read about neighborhood and housing restrictions. You can read about funding cuts to education, inadequate health care, urban business, and infrastructural decline, the augmentation and the militarization of the police, and also mass incarceration, that all of which negatively impacts non-white African American and Latino communities disproportionately to white communities. Again, it's a reality that we have to accept. Now, we can spout the percentages, we can spout the numbers, but what I'm interested in, what we should be interested in, is why? Why is there disproportionate elements? And I will talk a little bit about this in terms of the legacy of housing. But a simple definition of what we mean by systemic racism is you can, or inherited racism. I could use myself as an example. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, a man that I loved deeply. He had great stories about the war, and I learned a lot from him. He was also a Reformed Baptist, and I learned a lot from his teaching of Scripture. When he died, I think it was the first funeral that I went to where I was just in tears. I remember seeing him in an open casket, and I just cried my eyes out. He was a D-Day war hero, a chaplain in the Army. I don't think he was part of the first waves at D-Day, but nonetheless, he was on the beaches of Omaha, which is good enough for me to call him a hero, and he really was. Now, after the war, my grandfather and his family benefited from the GI Bill. He was offered benefits in the area of education and housing, and he became kind of the epitome of the sort of new suburban life, the post-World War II American citizen that benefited from the wealthiest period in American history. And my parents, who are baby boomers, were also part of that generation. They were born and raised into the peak, the golden age of American capitalism. Again, not everybody benefited. Within middle class strata, you have sort of lower middle class, middle class, and then upper middle class. There is a range within that. We are speaking in generalities. But my own parents benefited from the GI Bill. My grandfather, my grandparents, my parents benefited. They got into good schools, good housing, etc. And that did, although I don't like this term, but I will use it in this case, it did trickle down to me. I benefited from what my grandfather benefited from. Now, again, maybe they were not aware of it. When I was young, I was not aware of the benefits that I received because of my inherited race. And the disproportionate sort of social structure that imbued that experience. Now, I say that because there were plenty who fought in World War II, as my grandfather did, but they did not benefit from the GI Bill. They were not given loans for housing. They were not, their access to education was closed off. That is a clear representation of discrimination. And you don't have to be the one to discriminating to be part of a discriminating system. Now, that's just a small examples, and others can share those examples as well. And I don't say that to cast blame, to search out any sort of punishment. or to generate any sort of resentment. It's just the reality of the case. But I'm going to do something a little bit different in talking about inherited racism, or the consequences of racism, in two parts. I want to offer you really two examples. The one example is the experience of Native Americans over time, particularly around the end or sort of the midway of during the Civil War, although you can go back earlier to the 17th century. But I'll focus more on the late or the mid to late 19th century. The Native American experience after the Civil War, around the time of the Civil War and after the Civil War, is a clear example of the consequences of, or offers a clear example of the consequences, the long-term consequences of overt racism. Malcolm X talked about the Native American reservations as internal colonies. Now, these are not the only internal colonies, internal meaning in the US. These internal colonies were not only these Native American reservations, but also, urban areas, which I want to talk about as they relate to African American existence in life. But I bring these up because the consequences of this life has, continued. You can see in the map here, right, these small sort of red-orange blasts. These are some of the major battles that were fought in what became known as the Indian Wars. Famous battles like the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle of Wounded Knee, the Chivington Massacre, 1864, Chief Joseph's Rebellion, 1877. This is around the time of men like Geronimo, who led raids off the reservation. Colonel John Chivington, who's famous or infamous for the Chivington Massacre, when he testified before Congress for his activity in murdering a village of Cheyenne Indians, said that the Native American stands in the way of American progress and must be exterminated. Now, there were a lot of ideas that were fueling the removal of the Native Americans, often referred to as the conquest of the West. By the late 1890s, one historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, looked back on what was going on in America and developed what became known as the frontier thesis, the idea that the West is this place that draws out, not just draws out, but actually creates the American character, assuming that the West is nice and empty and it is savage, it's uncivilized, and it's there that Americans gain their character and their identity. They sort of create themselves, if you will. Social Darwinism also played a role in sort of justifying, again, in some cases after the fact, in the late 19th century, all of a sudden social Darwinism becomes a way to kind of justify the removal of lesser races. But really the big thing that moved Anglo or white Americans out west to conquer the West and to remove Native Americans was the railroad. The railroad in America was one of the first big businesses. It's not only a big business, but it was really the first infrastructural apparatus of American empire, not just the American empire, but the British Empire as well. As a big business, this infrastructural tool, the railroads, was necessary in creating the American empire. So we have here the removal of Native Americans that is fueled by an expansion of the capitalist infrastructure and therefore capitalism itself. You can never separate capitalism from the empire. I often share this with my students. I give a little bit of what I call the triad of empire. Right? So here you have at the top big business or the corporation, right? And that includes everything in that. That includes not just the infrastructure like the railroad, but big commercial agriculture, not only in the plains, like agribusiness, farming, the cattle industry, but also the oil industry, the mining industry. And then when you move outside of the US, you have big agricultural businesses in sugar, in places like Hawaii, and other major large businesses in places like the West Indies, etc. Now, capitalism cannot help but to expand. It must expand. It must find raw resources. Well, usually where these resources are, there are human inhabitants. And they can either sort of join the capitalist developments, but most often it wasn't even when native citizens joined the process, they were still sort of not part of the benefits of the empire. But you also have to protect those interests. So another part of empire is the military, or some sort of police force to protect the interests of big business. Now, of course, you also need legitimacy. You need legality to do that, and this is where the government. Oops, I spelled it right. This is where the government comes in. This is the if you will, the triangle of empire. These are the key points of the empire. And when one begins to feel stress, okay, or one part begins to sag, then it draws the others into sagging as well, and the others will try to kind of boost themselves up, jolt themselves up to regain or reposition one of the three pegs. So, for instance, if you look at the economy is sagging right now. America's empire, I should say this, America's empire is significantly ailing. And it was ailing first in 1968, and then by the early 1970s. And then, of course, by the early 2000s, and then 2008. So this is 1968 were particularly was a confrontation of the American empire, and in the 70s, but also 2001 was also a confrontation. 9/11 was a direct confrontation of the American empire, and it should not be surprising that the terrorists, and I will call them terrorists, and I in no way condone the language, but in 9/11, what did the terrorists target? They targeted the points of the empire. the symbolic points of empire, the world, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon. And they targeted, obviously, Washington, D.C. The White House never made it there, as we know. But that was on their minds, to target these the three portions. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, that when the economy begins to sag, the other parts feel a little bit threatened. Okay? So the government and the military, but particularly the military right now, as we see with the militarization of the police around the country, is experiencing some serious anxiety, and is really kind of recharging itself, and it seems to recharge itself every few years, to kind of regain the status, to regain business. Donald Trump is already talking about how the stock market is doing great, the economy is doing great. Right? He needs to sort of hold up that wing of the empire. Okay. So as the empire begins to grow, right, as the railroad moves west, the military, the government employed, not only does the government have a bunch of different acts that, or legislative acts that opens up land for Anglo-white settlement, but it also commissions the military to protect the advancements of the railroad. Hence the experience of George Armstrong Custer. Not the smartest fry in the shed. Wait, is that how it goes? Not the smartest needle in the haystack. Anyway, you know what I mean. And as the Native American wars battled the coming of the empire, they were more and more forced onto smaller and smaller groupings of land, what we call reservations, right? And the conquest of the West and the removal of Native Americans to these colonies became the kind of blueprint for American empire. This also was applied to segregated areas after the war that intensified in the 1970s and the 1980s, where we then see the consequence of this sort of disproportionate impact on communities throughout the United States. So you can see some of the reservations here. Now, this is something that we don't think about. Many scholars will talk about that this was America was involved in this Holocaust. I would definitely call this a cultural Holocaust, only because Native American culture is certainly in the collective memory of Native Americans, but not so much of the historical memory of many Americans. Well, what are the consequences of this? You see, reservations are internal colonies, which means they are dependent on the empire. This is how a colonial society works. If you think of colonial societies in Africa or in Southeast Asia in the 19th century, they become dependent. The empire comes in, extracts things from the country, and then sells things back to them. But the goal is to make sure that these colonies are economically dependent on larger powers, right? After World War II, a new form of empire called neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism tied independent countries or independent nations, allowed independent nations, let's say in Africa, to maintain their national identity. However, they became economically dependent on the World Bank, the IMF, you know, the Washington Consensus. So, which allows these major international government economic agencies to say to these colonies, essentially these nations, to say, oh no, you're a nation, but really you're a colony, right? Okay, but what's the consequence of Native American reservations? Here are the consequences. Native American reservation still has the highest rates of infant mortality, pneumonia, hepatitis, tuberculosis, and suicide throughout the country. It's been within the last 10 years, maybe 10 or 15 years, that some Native American reservations have become aware of or been educated in the realities of HIV/AIDS. Life expectancy, on average, is about 25 years less than the national average. The federal government is woefully deficient in providing adequate health care. Hospitals constantly deal with failing facilities, obsolete equipment, and too few physicians. The government, for instance, the federal government, for instance, spends more per capita on healthcare for federal prisoners. This is an invisible structure. It's not invisible to Native Americans, but it's invisible to many of us around the world. Reservations are dependent on things coming into their colony. They're dependent on the empire. And have you ever wondered why Native Americans have invested so much time in casinos? You think they're going to get a loan from a bank so that they can climb the economic ladder, so that they can rise in status? It's free money. I'm not laughing because it's funny. Okay, that's just one example of sort of structural racism. But let's get to the post-World War II period, the golden age of capitalism, and focus on the growth of modern suburbia. The Federal Housing Administration insured long-term mortgage loans made by private lenders and home building. FHA insurance went mostly to new residential developments, usually on the margins of urban areas, the suburbs, hastening the decline of older inner city neighborhoods. I'll mention that in a second. Production was big. It was great. You can get a small, affordable loan and have your home. And the home in America has often been the symbol of the American dream. So if you're able to buy a home, purchase a home, you then have achieved the American dream. But some people were literally excluded from these neighborhoods. Some were not able to get the loans, as I'm jumping ahead, but that's okay. I don't mind repeating myself. Some were not able to get these loans. Now, think about, if you will, just jump to 2008, for instance, in the practice of what we call predatory lending. Banks knew that they could make a quick buck by deceiving people into getting these faulty loans. And they knew that certain groups would default on their loans. And who was disproportionately affected by the housing crisis but Latin American families and African American families. One of the first suburban homes was called Levittown. It was one of the first planned communities in New York, eventually encompassing more than 17,000 houses and 82,000 people. Developer William Levitt was described as the General Motors of the housing industry. and was the first to bring mass production techniques to home building. Building materials were pre-cut and prefabricated at a central factory, and assembled on-site into houses by largely unskilled non-union labor. Right? So here, what we see again is the connection of capitalism with the developments of housing. So for many in America, this was truly a dream. This was great. It wasn't always a dream. This consumerism has a way to, there's a brokenness, there's a fallen aspect of consumerism, and the sort of sameness, and you could see it here, the sameness of suburban life was sometimes choking and stultifying for particularly women, which then inspired middle-class women, which then inspired the second wave of feminist movement following the profoundly genius work of Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique. You may not agree with everything Betty Friedan said, but she says things in The Feminine Mystique that are pretty rich and profound. And by the way, that would be one underside of suburban life that I'd like to talk about in later mini lectures. But there were some overt racist policies that were instituted in the suburbs. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said, quote, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. For a long time, America was afraid of allowing races to live in close proximity with one another. The idea of integration was dangerous to the health of the country. And that idea goes back to the American Revolution, the early republic. So-called restrictive covenants barring blacks, single women, and other ethnic minorities were allowed. Non-white population remained in the cities, later called project housing. Businesses relocated from the cities and moved closer to the suburbs, creating the modern privatized mall. The mall is kind of a privatized urban center, a privatized city where you can pick and choose who's allowed to come. So think about that. For instance, those that had a lot of the wealth that benefited from this golden age of capitalism were moving into the suburbs. And so the businesses in the urban center said, we got to follow the money. Hey, no offense to you people. No offense to those who can't come into the suburbs. No offense to you in the urban center. We just want to make a buck, right? What's driving us is the profit motive, right? Well, what's that going to lead to? Right, that's going to lead to a decline in business, a decline in public funding for the infrastructure, for public housing, public schools. And so you see a major plummeting. So those people that are living then in certain urban centers because of white flight, as it's often called, suffer economically, serious economic burdens. Now remember, the socio-economic dynamics of life helps to shape the culture, which means that the people who are living in poorer areas in comparison to wealthier areas like the suburbs makes people believe, they ignore the cultural aspect, but it makes people believe that those in the suburbs, those who are wealthy because they are just hard workers and they're smart. Those people that are in poorer neighborhoods, urban areas, are poor because of their essence. because of who they are. And all they need to do is just work hard. But in both cases, both in terms of wealth and both in terms of poverty, there were major conditions that lifted one and depressed the other. We still abide, in America, we still abide by this myth that individual hard work will advance you. In some cases, this happens, but it's more of an exception than the general rule, which makes it more closer to a myth than that of reality. Most people who are wealthy in America, even the insanely wealthy in America, are wealthy because they inherited their wealth. Anyway, getting off track a little bit, not quite, but in 1960, not one of Levittown's residents was African American, and owners who rented out their homes were told to specify that their houses would not be used or occupied by any person other than members of the white races. Now, I know what you're thinking. A lot has changed. Yes, a lot has changed in regard to restricted covenants, in regard to redlining. But some of these things, again, take on new forms. Redlining takes on new forms, and we can see examples of redlining that goes well into the, you can see it today. So there are different type of pressures or restrictions that maintain segregated areas. Between 1950 and 1970, about 7 million white Americans left cities for the suburbs, meanwhile, nearly 3 million blacks moved from the south to the north, greatly increasing the size of urban ghettos and even creating new ones. The process of racial exclusion was reinforced as a result. Non-whites remained concentrated in manual and unskilled jobs, the result of unemployment, discrimination, and their virtual exclusion from education opportunities at public and private institutions. Go back to our example of 2008, the Great Recession, if you don't think these things are happening now. Those that lost their homes were disproportionately Latin American and Mexican and African American families. At the same time, there was a massive decline in higher education from both of these groups. And there's a simple reason why. People needed to work to survive. There was a game that was played by Wall Street bankers. We lost. The majority of America lost. And when those banks failed, what did government do? Remember, there was a stress in the empire. It was declining. What did the government do? It boosted it up. It rewarded the bad decisions of Wall Street and the Wall Street banks. There's something perverse about that. Suburbanites became increasingly fearful that any non-white presence would lower the quality of life and destroy property. Non-whites, therefore, needed to be contained, which by the end of the 1960s led to the beginning of a massive expansion of not only the police, but also of police culture, militarized culture, beginning with President Nixon, a major boost by the Reagan administration, another major boost in 93, 95, 98 by the Clinton administration, all the way to the still familiar stop and frisk programs, And so in one sense, the police have been burdened with almost solving all of society's problems. But the way to solve the problems is to contain the population, not come up with programs that would help these areas. They're not capable to help in the area of health, in education, in public housing. The police has the police military culture has morphed into not an agency that keeps the peace, but an agency that is trying to regain the empire. It's trying to make the American empire great again. But with all the protests going on right now, we're seeing a challenge, a serious challenge to this sort of last gasp to bring the empire back onto its feet. William Levitt was criticized for not allowing or supporting the idea that only whites should live in his community. And here's what he said. This is very interesting. If we sell one house to a Negro family, then 90 or 95% of our white customers will not buy into the community. This is their attitude, not ours. That is, the ones that are the customers. That's their attitude, it's not mine, right? So he's pulling a Pontius Pilate here. And hey, it's not me, I'm not racist, they're racist. As a company, our position is simply this. We can solve a housing problem, or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two. We cannot combine the two. The problem with that statement, there's a lot that's wrong with this. The problem with this statement is that the two are connected. And notice the way William Levitt, and this is familiar language. He says, look, I've got to be, faithful, if you will, to my business. I've got to be faithful to my stockholders. It's all about the bottom line. It's all just business. No hard feelings. It's just business. Well, this is what we've inherited. And like I said, there have been major changes, significant changes to these unjust laws. So the system is, I would say, cracking. But nonetheless, we still are, what we're chipping away at, in some cases aggressively chipping away at, is what we've inherited. It's what we've inherited. I'll give you a final problem related to systemic racism or inherited racism is the problem of political disempowerment. Robert Ballard, he's the author of Dumping in Dixie. He connects the environmental movement with racism. But in one of his discussions, he uncovered something kind of interesting. There was a report by the Searle Association. The Searle Associates is an independent public relations firm. And they were in talks with the California Waste Management Board in 1984. California Waste Management was dealing with basically, if you remember back in the 80s, things like toxic waste. Where are we going to put the waste from industry? And it's something that we are dealing with today. Well, the report by the Searle Associates to the California Waste Management Board in 1984, in one place the report stated, all socioeconomic groupings tend to resent the nearby siting of major facilities, wasteful facilities. But the middle and upper socioeconomic strata possess better resources to effectuate their opposition. middle and higher socioeconomic strata neighborhoods should not fall within the 1 mile and 5 mile radius of the proposed site. They knew that they had more of the financial resources to battle something like that. So what was the solution according to Robert Ballard? Where then will incinerators or other polluting facilities be sited? For Searle Associates, the answer is low income, disempowered neighborhoods with a high concentration of non-voters. The ideal site, according to their report, has nothing to do with environmental soundness, but everything to do with lack of social power. At major waste, close to major waste sites, you will find lower income and non-white communities. And that has remained today. Areas where there is failing infrastructure, you'll find low income, non-white neighborhoods and communities. This has continued. Well, again, I offer these discussions to raise awareness. And so I hope you will consider these examples and consider the fact that, I guess generally speaking, that institutional racism or systemic racism, inherited racism, is a reality, though you may not have experienced it yourself. Others have.